Hello and good evening. I'm Sophie Rosenfeld from the History Department here at Penn, and it's my great honor to welcome you all to the very first event in this year's Wolf Humanities Center series devoted to the theme of choice. And we're very lucky to have with us on this occasion two distinguished scholars of choice. Our main speaker this evening will be, as you know, Sheena Iyengar, St. Lee Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. And to introduce her now, and to lead off our conversation with Professor Iyengar afterward, we have with us also Allison Hoffman, Professor of Law here at Penn and also a renowned scholar of choice. For those of you looking for something timely to read, I highly recommend her article, The ACA's Choice Problem, particularly good this week, I think. In other words, we're in very good hands. And so, Professor Hoffman, we turn next to you.
It is such a pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sheena Iyengar. Anyone who writes or thinks about choice has read and is shaped by Professor Iyengar's work, including myself. She may be most known for her work on choice overload, which happens when people confront too many choices, and which I cite too regularly in my own research. But her thinking is much more nuanced than just that idea. In preparation for today's event, I revisited her 2010 monograph, The Art of Choosing, a beautiful book that threads together narratives and scientific research. And I was reminded of two things in rereading it. First, it focuses on the notion of control as much as choice and cultural differences in terms of how much control people want. That insight is profound for the space where I think about choice, health insurance. My work has pushed back on the idea of health insurance choices having value that we should try to foster and preserve. Yet, people see their choice of health insurance as a proxy for control. And when we think about health, and we think about our health, at least in the United States, control is meaningful. A deep challenge we face in health policy is how to help people have meaningful control instead of meaningless choices. The second thing I was reminded of is how poetic Professor Iyengar's prose is. To give you a sense, I want to read some of Professor Iyengar's own words so you can get a window into both the substance and the artistry of her writing on choice. In the prologue to her book, she retells her own story through the lens first of destiny and then of chance. Here's an excerpt first from the first, Destiny, which she describes as more in line with her parents' worldview. She writes, I was born in Toronto 1 month early and during a blizzard that covered the city in snow and silence. The surprise and the low visibility conditions that accompanied my arrival were portents, although they went unrecognized at the time. My mother, as a recent immigrant from India, was of two worlds, but she would pass that multiple identity on to me. My father was making his way to Canada, but had not yet arrived. His absence at my birth was a sign of the deeper absence yet to come. Looking back, I see all the ways in which my life was set the moment I was born into it. Whether in the stars or in stone, whether by the hand of God or some unnameable force, it was already written, and every action of mine would serve to confirm the text. Then she retells the same story as one of pure chance. It's a jack-in-the-box life, she writes. You open it carefully, one parcel at a time, but things keep springing up and out. That's how I came into the world, suddenly. A month before I was due, my father not even able to receive me. He was still in India, where my mother had always imagined she, too, would be. Yet somehow she had ended up in Toronto with me in her arms, and through the window she could see the snow whirl. Like those flakes of ice, we were carried to other places, Flushing, Queens, and then Elmwood Park, New Jersey. She describes from there the moments of chance that defined her life, from inheriting a rare form of retinal degeneration to losing her father to a heart attack when she was 13. And then finally, she turns to a third way of seeing the world, as one of choice, what she describes as, quote, what was still possible and what I could make happen. It is that frame that motivates much of her professional career. Professor Iyengar has made a lot happen since spending her undergraduate years here at Penn, where she earned a BS in economics from Wharton and a BA in psychology. She went on to get a PhD in social psychology from Stanford and is now the St. Lee Professor of Business at Columbia Business School, where her research looks at choice both empirically and comparatively as a concept that varies culturally. I could not possibly name all of her accolades, which include being named as among the top 50 most influential business leaders and receiving the Presidential Early Career Award. She's an extremely dynamic speaker with widely viewed TED Talks, and she advises leading companies on employee motivation and performance. With that, I am delighted to welcome Professor Iyengar here today to talk with us about rethinking the value of individual choice. Professor Iyengar, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. That was such a beautiful introduction. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So here's what I want to do today. I want to take you on a brief journey around the world. Since we all can't travel right now, we're going to do it in this talk. We're going to go around the globe. My base of operations, though, is going to be the US. And as we go around the world, we're going to see the different perspectives on choice. Now, I'm going to start my journey in the other side of the planet in a city called Kyoto, Japan, where I did part of my dissertational research about 25 years ago when I was a PhD student at Stanford University. Now, as somebody who was very interested in choice and very interested in culture, I knew before I went to Japan that I was likely to encounter misunderstandings and maybe some different assumptions about how the world worked. But even I was on occasion rather surprised. I remember on the second day that I was in Kyoto, I went to this small tea shop and I ordered a cup of green tea. And I asked the waiter to bring me some sugar to go with my green tea. And this was a very traditional Japanese place. And so the waiter coughed and said, I am so sorry, we do not put sugar in our green tea. And I sort of nodded and smiled at him and said, yeah, I understand that you're not supposed to put sugar in green tea, but I really like my tea sweet. So could you please bring me some sugar? Again, he said, you do not put sugar in green tea. And I again acknowledged that, yes, I understand that you don't put sugar in green tea, but I would really like to put sugar in my green tea. Well, he seemed very distressed by this and walked over to the manager, and pretty soon a conversation ensued. And there must have been about 3 or 4 people there that were discussing this. And my Japanese wasn't so good, but the only thing that I could catch is they kept pointing at me and kept saying something about sugar and green tea. And after a while, the manager came up to me and said, can you please tell me what you would like to order? And I said, I would like to have some green tea with sugar. And then he says, we do not put sugar in green tea. And I said, well, but can I have sugar in my green tea? And then there was a pause, and he said, I am sorry, we do not have sugar. So I said, okay, fine. Then just give me a cup of coffee. So I was no longer going to try green tea that day. And they brought me a cup of coffee, and on the saucer were 2 packets of sugar. Now, I knew I probably shouldn't make a fuss and order a cup of green tea and put the sugar meant for the coffee in the green tea. That would probably rattle them a bit too much. But my failure to procure sugar for my green tea was not a misunderstanding. It was not a miscommunication. It was a difference, a fundamental difference in our ideas about choice. You see, as an American, I very much believed, look, I'm a paying customer. And as a paying customer, if I say I want X, you're supposed to give it to me, because as Burger King tells me, have it your way. And as Starbucks reminds me, happiness is in your choices. And so I'm supposed to get my tea the way I want it. But from the Japanese perspective, it was their job to protect this ignorant gaijin, foreigner. This ignorant gaijin for making the quote wrong choice, from doing something inappropriate, and so they needed to protect my face. As Americans, we believe that we have reached some sort of pinnacle in the way we practice choice. We believe that choice, as seen through the lens of American culture, gives us a sense of the innate, universal desire that all humans have. And so we believe that when we speak of things like the individual right to choose, that we're talking about something that's automatically understood and automatically desirable, so much so that when we offer it to other people, it's a gift. And so we believe that it's perfectly legitimate to foist this gift on the rest of the world. Unfortunately, people don't see it in the same way. We don't all see choice in the same way, to the same extent, in the same places. What I want to do today in our brief time together is I want to highlight 3 basic assumptions that we as Americans have come to hold about individual choice. And while I will describe to you some of the scientific studies that have been conducted a little while ago, about a decade ago, I want you to think about how these individual assumptions actually are affecting us now. And they're affecting the kinds of decisions that we are making right now as individuals and as a collective in our nation today. And what are the consequences of that? So the first assumption that I want to consider is the assumption that goes like this. If a choice affects me, then I should be the one to make it, because I'm the only one that can ensure that the quote right choice, the quote best choice is made. I'm the only one that can ensure that it will be successful. So in America, we believe that the locus of control lies in the individual, so that I, as an individual, separate myself from others. I, as an individual, figure out what I want and what I want to choose, and I will stick to that. When I know what I want, I will stick to that. And by sticking to that, that enables me to, quote, be my true self. But what does this assumption about choice and being my true self and every choice being enacted upon as a lone agent, what are the consequences of that? And is it always beneficial for us? I want to tell you a study that I did after I came back from Kyoto. And this was done in the late 1990s. And this was the first of a series of studies, but I'm going to tell you about the first one. And this was a study that I did in San Francisco. And it was done with children, Anglo and Asian American children, because I wanted to see differences in assumptions that were happening even before people might even be able to articulate it. And so these Asian and Anglo-American children who were around 7 years of age, they were divided up into one of 3 groups. The first group was given a choice. Which one of these 6 category of anagrams would you like to do? Family, animals, the usual suspects. Next choice. Which one of these 6 markers would you like to use when jotting down your answers? That was the first group. They got to choose. The second group of kids, when they came in, they were again greeted by Miss Smith, who was the experimenter. But now Miss Smith, the experimenter, told them which category of anagrams to do and which marker to use when jotting down their answers. In truth, they were doing the very same activity which the child in the choice condition had earlier chosen to do. Now, the third group of children, when they came in, they were told by Miss Smith that their mothers had chosen which category of anagrams that they would do and which color marker they would use when jotting down their answers. Subsequently, we measured their performance on the anagram task, and we also looked at their intrinsic motivation to do the task when they were no longer required to do so. And here's what we found. Anglo-Americans did their very best, more than 2 times better when they got to choose as compared to when it was chosen by Miss Smith or their mothers. In fact, if anything, there was a slight trend that suggested that people would actually perform worse for mom as compared to Miss Smith. I remember there was this one little girl named Mary that was outraged with the experimenter. She said, "You asked my mother? Like, how dare you?" What about the Asian American children? Here we saw a very different pattern. They performed the best when they did it for their mothers, where they thought their mothers had made the selection. Significantly better for their mothers than when they chose for themselves. Next best when they chose for themselves, and just as poorly as the Anglo-American children when it was for this stranger, Miss Smith. And in contrast to Mary, there was a little Japanese girl, Mayumi, who tugged on the experimenter's skirt and said, "Could you please tell my mommy I did it just like she said?" It was a positive thing to know that mommy was involved. It was reassuring. You know, I want you to consider two contrasting assumptions about choice. The first goes like this. If a choice affects me, then I should be the one that makes it because I know what's best. Consider an alternative assumption. If a choice affects me, then I want the opinions, the direction, the influence of those whom I trust and respect. I want to make sure that the quote right choice is made, and so I want those individuals involved in the making of the choice. That is when I would thrive. Two assumptions, equally valid. So for the Asian American children, they saw having their mothers involved as an opportunity to reinforce their interdependence with their mothers. It was an opportunity to have harmony, community. The choice wasn't seen as something that exists in a vacuum. This was an opportunity to help cement the relationship between the self and the beloved other. By contrast, for the Americans, it was a completely different paradigm. Choice is always supposed to be an independent act. It's always supposed to be an act that is private and self-defining. So here you have two entirely different views of choice, whether it should be purely individualistic or whether it should be interdependent. And you might say that these are differences that merely separate Americans versus, say, members of other collectivist cultures. But these differences, if you dig deep into those assumptions, they do not just differentiate us from other geographic peers. These differences separate us within our borders. They separate us in some very fundamental ways, like many issues that differentiate between our political parties, like the Democrats versus Republicans. How many differences of opinion boil down to the preference or the priority given to individual rights versus collective interdependence, collective welfare. Take even a seemingly small issue that's confronting our nation at this very moment, like the wearing of a mask. How do you frame that choice? Should I frame that choice as an act of an individual choice about my rights? After all, wearing a mask, it's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. It doesn't make me look as attractive. I can't really breathe as well. You know, I need to worry about what's good for me. It's my choice. I understand the consequences on me if I don't wear it. So should it be seen as a matter of individual rights, or should it be seen as a matter of collective welfare? My choice affects your welfare. Your choice affects my welfare. Which consequences do we highlight? And to some extent, we could say that when there are differences that separate nations, those are ones where we could say, look, you do it your way, I'll do it my way. But when it's differences that affect our collective response, where there are consequences for us as individuals and as a collective, at that point, we have to ask ourselves, what assumption do we want to hold on to? And what costs are we willing to pay in order to hold on to our assumptions? Let me now introduce the second assumption. The more choices I have, the better off I will be, because the more choices I have, the more likely to find what I want. And so if I can find what I want, I'll be happier. So are we happier the more choices that we have? You know, shortly after the Soviet Union fell, I started to do a series of interviews in Russia and Eastern Europe. So I want to take us over to that part of the world. And one of the things I used to do and had a lot of fun doing was I used to run these focus groups with people, whether they were business leaders, whether they were people on the streets that I would meet in the park. And I would ask them questions about choice. What kind of choices did they have in their everyday lives? What kind of choices did they value? One of the things that I discovered quite by accident was that one of the things I would do as an act of hospitality was that I would offer them soda pops to have as we chatted. And I remember very distinctly, this one guy says to me, and this was originally in Russia, and then it happened again in Warsaw, Poland. These men said to me, it doesn't matter, it's just one choice. One choice? Wait a second. I just gave you some Coke, some Mountain Dew, some Sprite. It's not one choice, these are totally different. You know, as an American, I'm slightly outraged. I mean, I understand that, you know, the scientists tell us we can't tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but you and I know that there really is a difference and we can tell. But anyway, here I gave them 7 different choices and the guy says to me, one choice. I got curious about this and I began to present the choices to all of the focus groups and I would ask them, how many choices are these? And again, I found that members of Eastern European cultures would describe it as one choice, soda or no soda. When I added juice and water, then they would call it 3 choices. And it wasn't that they didn't know that there was a difference between Coke and Mountain Dew and Sprite. They did know that there was a difference. They even knew the ads associated with these various sodas. But as one guy put it to me quite succinctly, he said, I mean, I don't need 10 different types of chewing gum. I'm not saying I should have no choice, but these choices are just artificial. Yet another person said, these are not meaningful choices. You know, as Americans, we spend our whole lives training ourselves to spot the difference, so that every choice matters and every difference between choices matters. But does the entrance of every single choice give us more freedom? Does it liberate us? Or is it possible that the greater presence of more choices, more information might actually serve to suffocate us? You know, if you come back from Eastern Europe now to the United States, since the 1970s, there has been an exponential explosion of choice. One of the biggest changes in our worlds. In the 1970s, the average grocery store had only 9,000 products in it here in the United States. Today, the average brick and mortar grocery store has about 40,000 products in it and growing. You go on Walmart during COVID times, it's actually crossed multiple millions of options that you have. Amazon, over 300 million options. Starbucks, 80,000 different drink combinations. And these are just normal choices, like what do you want to eat, what do you want to read, what do you want to wear, the sort of physical products. If you look at movies, entertainment, did you know that Apple now offers you over 2.2 million apps? You have over 200 streaming services, many of which that were introduced just during COVID time. And now let's look at choices that didn't exist during the time of our parents, like how to find your soulmate. Did you know that right now, if you go around the globe, there's at least 5,000 known dating apps, of which at least 2,500 exist here in the United States? You can really pick your niche preferences. Ladies, if you like a beard, there's an app just for men with beards. Cat lovers, farmers only, gluten-free, any kind of video game preference that you want to connect on. You name your type and you will find it on our dating apps. Now, it's not just that we have so many more choices today than we've ever had before. Think about the information that goes along with that choice. It is estimated that about 2.5 quintillion bits of information are created every single day. It's estimated that we check our phones about 150 times a day on average. It's estimated we spend about 28% of our week on social media. It's estimated that when you consider all the information coming at you, consciously, subconsciously, between ads and other bits of information that's coming at you, it's the equivalent of reading 174 newspapers. That's all the information that's going into us. So we're constantly processing choice and information. What are the consequences of offering us all this? Well, in Choiceland, which is the United States, I did a study a number of years ago, and I did this study actually at a tipping point. This is actually at a point when we didn't have as much of an explosion. It was done in the late 1990s, 2000. Some of you might have heard about it. It's called the JAM study, and it's often referred to as the famous JAM study, but I'm going to tell you the truth about this study. So I used to go to this store, and it was an upscale grocery store located in Menlo Park, California. Fancy store. This store really emphasized variety. So they had 250 different types of mustards, vinegars, mayonnaises, over 500 different types of fruits and vegetables, 100 different types of extra virgin olive oil. Well, I found myself going to this store because I was very curious, but I also found myself never buying anything. And so I decided to do a little study, which the store agreed to let me do. So we picked jam. The original jam aisle had 348 jams, and we picked one particular brand, Wilkin & Sons, the Queen of England's jam. And we did a very simple study. So we set up a tasting booth right near the entrance of the store where we looked at two things. First, in which case were people more likely to stop and sample some jam? Oh, we set up a tasting booth where we either put out 6 different flavors of jam or 24 different flavors of jam. And we looked at two things. First, in which case were people more likely to stop and sample some jam? And second, in which case were people more likely to buy a jar of jam? And what we found was that more people were attracted, meaning they stopped, when we had 24 on display, 60% versus the 40% who stopped when there were 6 on display. But when it came down to buying behavior, we now saw the opposite, where more people bought a jar of jam when they had less than when they had more. So of the people who stopped when there were 24 on display, 3% of them bought a jar of jam. Of the people who stopped when there were 6 on display, 30% of them bought a jar of jam. So here's what we observed. People were more attracted to the larger display of options, but when it came down to making a choice, they were more likely to make a choice when they saw less than when they saw more. Now, this was the first illustration of something that we have many names for now. We call it anything from choice paralysis to the too much choice effect, to the choice overload effect, to the cognitive overload effect, to FOMO. I mean, we have so many names for it. This was the first illustration of the phenomenon, and now there's been hundreds of studies, half the studies I don't even know about, that have looked at the consequences of offering people more and more choice. And I'm going to just summarize what those consequences are. First, the more choices people have, the more likely they are to delay, to procrastinate, to choose not to choose. Now, choosing not to choose is perfectly fine when we're talking about jam. It's actually better for my waistline. However, people are choosing not to choose because they get overwhelmed about things that matter, like medical decisions, like retirement savings, like voting. Second, the more choices people have, the more likely they are to engage in suboptimal choosing. They make errors. They don't keep track of all the information. They pick the simple option just because it's simple. They exhibit inconsistent preferences. They perform less well at their jobs. Children perform less well in their school if they're given too many choices. For example, if I gave kids 24 different markers or 24 different anagram tasks like I gave you or showed you earlier, they actually would perform less well. Third, the more choices people have, the less satisfied they are with that which they have chosen. And that's true whether you're talking about what movie you're going to watch tonight, what career you're going to undertake, if you just flood yourself with choices. And we certainly all know what it's like to get dating fatigue and dating app fatigue and swipe fatigue when it comes to dating. After a while, it's just, I don't care. So this effect, this too much choice effect, you might say to me, look, I hear you, it's a lot. Our brains have, some limitations, but you know what? We're fixing it. New technology, it's going to fix it. Just need some even more sophisticated AI and machine learning. And certainly AI and machine learning is helping, right? Google is helping with the search, and increasingly Siri and Alexa are going to help us. They can help us do a lot better at picking and finding.
According to Cosmopolitan.
Sorry, I just got Alexa working. Let me just turn her off. Alexa, stop. Okay. Well, that's one of the downfalls of having such AI and machine learning in your midst. Anyway, so yes, these types of tools can help us become better at picking and finding, but it doesn't tell us what we want. It doesn't tell us what's the question we're trying to answer. It doesn't tell us the criteria by which we can exercise judgment. That only we can do. It can simply execute on whatever we tell it to do. So we can't delegate that. One of the things we're seeing during this time of COVID, my PhD student, Blaine Horton, has been doing studies every 6 weeks around the United States, because we have this naturalistic experiment going on where COVID rates are varying and lockdown rates are varying around the country. And so we're looking at people's responses and in terms of how they handle choice during this time of COVID. And one of the striking findings that's coming out is that the people who are pursuing either the same choices as before, so they just do more of it, they watch more TV, etc., or they're just randomly pursuing choices, they're actually not the ones that are happier. It's the ones that are taking the time to figure out what choices really matter to them. Figuring out some sort of new purpose or a new skill they want to have, or finally doing that project that they've always said they would do and now are using that time to do that thing which they thought was meaningful. Those are the people that are experiencing greater authenticity and greater happiness. You know, I can't say, and I cannot arbitrarily start taking choices and randomly crossing them off. But I do think that each of us ought to ask ourselves, as individuals and as a collective, how many choices do we really need? And which choices should I be making, are worth making, versus which choices are simply distracting me from my larger goals? Which brings me to the third assumption. And the third assumption that we as Americans hold dear to our hearts is that you should never say no to choice. That you should never say no to choice. To look at this assumption, I want to take you to Paris, and I also want to take you to Chicago. And I want to describe to you a young couple that lived in Chicago. Now, there were couples like this both in Chicago and in Paris. But I'm going to describe to you the story of Susan and Daniel Mitchell, who lived in the outskirts of Chicago. Susan and Daniel Mitchell were a young couple who were about to have a baby. And they had already named this baby because they knew her gender was going to be a girl. So they had named her Barbara after her grandmother. When Susan was 7 months pregnant, she started to experience contractions in the middle of the night and had to be rushed to the hospital. During that night, the doctors had to perform a cesarean. But Barbara suffered cerebral anoxia, which means a loss of oxygen to the brain. 2 days later, the doctors gave the Mitchells a choice. They could either take Barbara off of life support now, in which case she would die within hours, or they could keep her on life support, in which case she would still probably die within the next few days. And if she lived, she would never walk, talk, or be able to interact with others. What did they want to choose? What would you choose? It's probably one of the most deadly, heart-wrenching choices that any of us could imagine making. Now, we looked at parents in Chicago and in Paris who were all having to make the same difficult choice. In all cases, life support was removed and the babies died within the day. But there was one big difference between the US and France. In France, the doctor makes the decision. The parent can say, look, because of religious beliefs, we don't want you to make this choice. So parents have veto power. But the default is that the doctors make the decision. In the United States, the parents have to sign the consent form. Does this difference make a difference? And it turns out it does. When we followed these parents, even up to a year later, the American parents were still struggling with the loss of their newborn infant. When you looked at their interviews, French parents were much more likely to say, Noah was here for so little time, but in that time, he gave us a new perspective on life. Yet another French parent said, I learned so much. My child taught me so much, even though the time was so little. American parents, by contrast, said things like, I keep thinking to myself, what if? What if I had chosen differently? Yet another parent said, I can't believe they got me to do that. Yet another parent said, I feel as if I performed an execution. And yet, when the American parents were asked, would you have rather have had the doctor make the choice instead, they all said no. Even though having made that choice left them feeling guilty, regretful, and in many cases, they were clinically depressed. These parents could not imagine giving up that choice because to do so would have gone against everything they had been taught and everything they had come to believe about the power and purpose of choice. Now, many of us might say, well, that's a dramatic and interesting story, but most of us won't ever have to deal with such a choice. And that's not true. Every single one of us will have to make that choice. Every single one of us will experience cancer or some other chronic disease, either ourselves or a loved one. Every single one of us will at some point in time have to figure out, how do you make that choice? And should we make that choice, or should we have that choice made by another? So that's what's going to happen. That's what's happening in our medical lives. What about even now? When you think about the pandemic and you look around the globe and we look to see the differences in response as to who gets to make the choice about how to handle the disease. Should it be left to the individual's opinion? Should it be left to that of the scientist? Should the scientist's view be regarded as equal to that of an individual? Should government figures' opinions and mandates be regarded as a mere opinion? Is there a difference between fact and opinion? If we elevate individual choice to a degree where every individual's choice is greater than facts, then every single choice is equal, regardless of which it is based on some subjective preference or whether it's based on data. Is that a choice that we want to make as a collective? Is that an assumption that we want to have as an addition to our core assumption? And are we willing to pay the price for clinging to that assumption? So I want to end by turning to a quote by one of my favorite writers, Joan Didion. She wrote in her essay, The White Album, and I quote here, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We interpret what we see. Select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience." End quote. The story Americans tell, the story upon which the American dream depends, is the story of limitless choice. This narrative promises us so much: freedom, success, happiness. It lays the world at your feet and says that you can have anything, everything. It's a great story. And it's understandable that we would be reluctant to revise it. But when you take a closer look, you start to see the holes, and you start to see that this story can be told in many other ways. As Americans, we have wanted to disseminate our ideas of choice around the globe, believing that our ideas will be welcomed with open hearts and minds, and yet so often the history books and the daily news prove us to be wrong. Because the phantasmagoria, the narrative is not the same. We don't all see the narrative in the same way, and we as Americans might even benefit by considering these other narratives and incorporating some of their narratives and some of their practices in our own assumptions about choice. As the great American poet Robert Frost once said, "Poetry is what is lost in translation." And by this, he means that what is beautiful, what is moving, what enables us to see something different cannot be communicated to others. But Joseph Brodsky, who once described himself as a Jew, Russian poet, English essayist, once said that it is poetry that is gained in translation, by which he meant that the very act of translation itself can be a transformative, creative act through which new possibilities can be born. I believe that when it comes to choice, there is far more to be gained than to be lost through the translation of our many narratives. Instead of replacing a narrative with another narrative, instead we can learn from each other's narratives, revel in the differences, and create new narratives. No matter where we are from and what our narrative is, it is our responsibility as individuals and as a collective to open ourselves to the different narratives. Because it is in this way that we can learn what choice can do and what choice can represent. And by doing this, it does not mean that we will become paralyzed by a moral relativism. Instead, it can teach us when and how to act and how to get the full potential of choice. If we learn to speak to one another, albeit in translation, then we can begin to see choice in all its strangeness, complexity, and compelling beauty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I would love to start off with a question that picks up where you left off. And as I was listening to you talk, I was remarking on how choice was important when you started doing your work. And in the United States, it has become even more important today in some ways. And in a way, it has become political and more so political over time. And so my question for you is, what happens when choice becomes a political rallying cry? This is, as you brought in the examples of COVID, this is part of what we see happening. It shuts down that openness that you were talking about being important at the end. So what happens when choice becomes political? Is there still opportunity to think about looking at different perspectives on choice and learning from how others treat it?
I mean, if you think about choice, as Americans, we've actually been very imaginative, right? We're actually the only culture in the world that treats it as a noun. We've given it a massive halo effect. Just the word choice in itself somehow promises everything to us, but yet, in truth, it's a verb. It's a tool you can use to pick and find. It's a tool you can use to create. And so I actually think that we need to get away from treating choice as a noun, because then we won't be able to cash in on it.
Great. I have a question from an attendee, and it's a question that gets at kind of what is driving the different the different responses that you see in different countries. So, so the question is, to what extent can different performance and choices be attributed to cultural attitudes or stereotypes, or versus to the development of material conditions in Russian or Poland? Which element is more decisive, the material or the cultural? And as another piece of that, the comparison between French and American parents' reaction is interesting, and wondering how religion factors in as well, considering how secular French society is as compared to Americans. So how do you think about what's driving some of the differences that you're seeing in different places?
I mean, religion absolutely seems to affect our narratives about choice. Whether it was intended to serve that role it's very hard to say, but certainly when you see the debate going on right now in Congress, right? Pro-life versus pro-choice, it essentially boils down to different narratives around who has the choice. And you see that not just between religious groups, but you also see that between political ideologies. Say, for example, communism versus capitalism and democracy. These are all different narratives on choice. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to unpack these, though, because we talk about democracy also as if it's one thing and it's got a halo. But what is democracy? It's just a group decision-making process. And a group decision-making process, once you label it that, it now allows you some space to innovate. Any group decision-making process can be revised.
Great, thank you. So a question from an audience member on kind of practical implications of some of your work as well, where you've shown that, that we get caught up in some choices, and a range of choices, some of which may make us happy, or some of which may make us, be neutral, and some of which may make us less happy. So what do you recommend? Do you have tools or methods or things that you recommend for people in terms of limiting less important choices and focusing on the ones that are worth spending time on?
Well, my rule is always, pick your three most important thing at any time. I can't handle more than three. So I believe very strongly you have to be choosy about choosing. Don't make every choice. Decide which choices are worth your time.
But then how do you make that decision? I mean, that's the hard part, right? Is which decisions are worth your time? How do you kind of do that triage process in the first place?
I think it is worth taking that time to say, this is the most important thing. Like, so for example, in my job, I say, okay, I'm going to focus on 3 things at any given time. And I stick to those. Or like take something, another one that's complex, like raising a child. What are the 3 most important things that I really want this child to possibly get from me? And that's it. Everything else, let it go. And most things, when people present choices, people have this way of constantly trying to suck you into choice, whether it's like, what do you want to eat, or what do you want to watch, or what restaurant you want to go to, and yada, yada, yada. Most choices I ask myself, is that really worth my time? And if you can learn to do that and say it's not worth your time, you'll free up a lot of space.
So if somebody asks you something and you decide it's not worth your time, you kick it back to them. You say you decide.
Yeah, you delegate it out. Like, for example, I have a wine refrigerator. I have about 20 wines in there. I have no idea what's in there. I just call the sommelier, tell them, okay, just get me 10 really good whites, 10 some really good reds. I give them some criteria, and they just surprise me. And I'm happy because I didn't waste an hour trying to go through all the choices. And I have this feeling of surprise every time I open up the bottle, and it's, some are good, some are great.
Great. So you
kind of also means that you have to learn not to sweat it if it's not perfect.
Yeah. Right. So that's part of it, is not feeling like there's a perfect choice you have to get to, but being happy with the choice set and then kind of going with it.
Yes. Just allowing yourself to delegate the stuff that's not that important.
Great. So
make a choice that's not that important. I will only make the choices that I think are really, really important.
So how can we talk a little bit about the impact that your research has had on how you think about on marketing, and how people have taken kind of your lessons and your learning and changed kind of how they pose choices to consumers, or how they, how they market particular choices to your consumer? Because so have they had, do you think that your research has had an impact on how the business world is operating? And if so, and then how does marketing then spin back to us how we think about choice and the importance of choice?
In the old days when I would talk about too much choice, people would, boo and didn't believe me. Now there's no such thing as booing. They just want to know how to further trim, how to be strategic, how to curate, how to help reduce the choice set, how to help you figure out what's the fastest way for you to get your preference. And so I think that different companies try out different ways of doing that. And that's become that's become something that's almost basic to almost every company now.
Who do you think does it well?
Who do I think does it well? Well, I think Apple does it amazing. Did you notice that they give you the feeling of choice, but they actually don't give you a lot of choice?
Absolutely.
And you feel really unique.
Yeah. Until everybody else is walking around with the same product as you, right? In the same way. Or maybe a slightly different color.
It doesn't matter, because the people that are walking around with an Apple product think different.
Right.
Remember the ad, the famous ad by Steve Jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. They think different, even if they look alike.
Exactly. And they're the ones who, quote, change the world.
So, what do you say to people who make decisions in a way that keeps doors open? Do you think that that's a common experience across cultures, or across as you've done different experiments and have talked to people? Are there people who want to choose all of the above or keep doors open? And how do you coach them to shift to thinking about choice in a more narrow way?
So I want to clarify something. When I say be choosy about choosing, I am having you narrow your choice set, but I'm not having you narrow your mindset about choice. I think you will think more expansively and be more creative as you impose constraints on yourself. You'll be able to take more advantage of your choices as you impose constraints. So I want you to be flexible, even as you reduce your choice set.
So to have a more meaningful kind of experience with choice, and to have choices, not to kind of narrow it down and not be able to take different paths, but to think more meaningfully about doing so.
I want you to think more carefully about what are those meaningful choices, and to spend your time on those meaningful choices rather than the trivial stuff.
How do you think about the difference between political versus consumer choices? Because when you talk about the research you've done, it spans a wide range of topics. And, do you think that we tend to, in the United States, do you think we tend to conflate those two? And should we be thinking about them differently?
I do think there are more similarities than people realize about our political choices versus our consumer choices. Like, I do think that when you have a stage with a lot of candidates up there, you're looking for anything that will enable you to differentiate. So it wouldn't surprise me if the color of one's hair ends up differentiating one. If you have so many choices and you really can't tell them apart. In some ways, products are easier to figure out what are the trade-offs. right? Because there'll be some attributes that are similar and some attributes that are different. And you could say, okay, well, these 5 products have these 5 things in common, like appliances, but then, you know, this appliance though will be faster on this, and this other appliance will be cheaper but slower. Okay, so that's actually an easier trade-off to understand. Humans may have a lot of similarities, and they may have a lot of differences, but it's not that easy to take a human being and boil them down in the same way. So in that sense, they are more complicated.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think there are some similarities, but I think it's also more complex.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one last question. We're just about out of time, but one of our audience members wants to return to my introduction of your work, in which you rehearsed a fate and a chance-based narrative of your life, ultimately landing on choice as the alternate, maybe preferred way of reading it. What are your current thoughts about fate, chance, and how they relate to matters of choice?
I think fate and chance put things in your path. Those could be positive, those could be negative. You use choice to decide what to do about it, if anything. So, you know, you can always tell the story of your life in terms of fate, chance, or choice. And however you tell the story of your life, there will be an element of truth to it, and it will teach you something about how it is you came to be who you are. You know, I am the daughter of my parents. I did have this set of random events thrown at me. But I think there's something special when you tell the story of your life in terms of choice, because choice is the only thing that gives meaning to everything you say and do. And it is the only tool you have that enables you to go from who you are today to whom you want to be tomorrow.
It's a wonderful note on which to end. It's an optimistic one, and it helps all of us in moments where we feel like our situations may be challenging to see a path forward. So I want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure talking with you and hearing you speak about your work. And I want to thank you for taking the time with all of us in the midst of a busy moment.
Thank you so much. And if any of you want to, I don't know how this system works, but I can stick around if you have more questions as individuals. And also if anybody wants to email me, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you so much. I will pass that word on, and I'll let the attendees know that they can do so. Thank you all for attending today. Sophie, did you want to say a last word?
I'm not sure if I can be. Can you hear me, Allison?
Yes, I can.
Okay, because I wasn't sure if I was unmuted or not. I simply want to say that this has been a wonderful conversation, and enormous thanks to you, Sheena, and to you, Allison, for discussing this with us. And thank you to all the participants for their wonderful questions. And please come back for more events. I hope this is, and I imagine it has, simply whetted your appetite for an ongoing conversation on this topic. Good night to everyone.